also knew that he had won the office because no one else in Mother Lode, Arizona, had wanted the thankless job of town marshal. Hell, Beck had only taken the position because it came with free room and board at Dulce's and all the beer he could drink. That was a mighty tempting offer for a man who had come westward to escape the complexities of his own mind. But being the law in a sleepy desert town like Mother Lode had proven to be far more challenging than he had been led to believe. The drunks were meaner, and the teamsters more cantankerous than he had expected. He had only survived because of his ability to know how to throw a punch and take one, too. The skills he had acquired in his previous life in Chicago, how to read a man, his movements, and the shift of his eyes, had helped him figure out what a man would do before he did it. The townsfolk of Mother Lode didn't like to see a paying customer buffaloed without a good reason, but they hated lawlessness even more, and liked the way John Beck carried out his duties. Mother Lode had proven a challenge, but not enough of a challenge to keep his past where it belonged. He had thought he had left his old life behind in Chicago, but some memories were too stubborn to die. It only took about a year for the old ghosts to track him down and start howling in his mind. The ghosts gave him an excuse to take Dulce up on that offer of free beer that came with the job. Maybe he had wanted someone to come along and take his badge away, as well as the burden of being a lawman along with it. But he had never considered anything like the Brickhouse Gang coming to a place like Mother Lode, and he had never dreamed that he would find himself banished to this cave. As he continued to watch the horse and rider that had to be a mirage, John Beck remembered that he had still been sane when Bram Hogan and his brothers dragged him from Dulce's and into the street. He remembered he hadn't been able to put up much resistance on account of being fairly drunk at the time, and he had still been sane when they dumped him in the horse trough and laughed at him. Sane enough to remember Bram Hogan laughing as he told his brothers to strip this law dog down to his long johns, boys. We wouldn't want the fine marshal here to catch his death of cold. Beck remembered the names of the men who had done Bram's bidding. The flea-bitten drover called Lem, the sharp-featured Mexican bandit named Laredo, the miniature version of Bram Hogan they called Steve, and the hawk-nosed, craggy-faced giant of a man they called Pearson. Beck could no sooner forget their names than he could forget his own. He remembered it must have been about 90 degrees that morning as they set to pulling off his clothes and dividing them up among themselves. He remembered still being sane when the brave men of the Brickhouse Gang set to beating him, too. A seemingly endless torrent of kicks to the ribs and back, punches to the face that quickly shut his eyes, and perhaps a whip or two across the back. The pain blurred into one gory memory and had been dulled just a bit by the beer that had still been in his system. The pain had come later, and with a vengeance, in the days of hell that had followed. He remembered being tied by the neck like a dog to the porch post of Dulce's saloon while the gang argued about which one of them would get his clothes and who would get his fine Sharp's rifle. Beck remembered Dulce and some of the other townsfolk crying at the sight of their lawman, beaten and laid low. He remembered wondering if they might be crying for themselves, too, for Beck was the only thing that stood between them and the ravages of the worst gang in the Arizona Territory. Beck knew he wasn't the only man in town who could fight them. Mother Lode had no shortage of miners who were rough enough to oust them and shop owners who could band together to do the job. There were more than a handful of men who worked the few ranches spread about on the outskirts of town who could make quick work of this ragged bunch. But even in his sorry state, tied to the porch post of a wind-swept saloon, Beck knew no one would lift a finger to stop these men or even help themselves. The risk was too great, and the reward too thin. These people would endure the Brickhouse Gang just as they endured the heat of the unforgiving sun and the thirst and the bitter winters of the Arizona Territory. These people didn't fight. They survived, and if they didn't think they could survive the Brickhouse Gang, they would simply pack their things and leave. So while John Beck appreciated the tears they shed for their fallen sheriff, he knew none of them would raise a hand in his defense. And he wasn't disappointed, even from